Tamerlane, also known as Timur, is one of history's most infamous figures, a man whose name evokes images of sweeping conquests, mass destruction, and an empire carved out of fear. Yet, before the terror he unleashed across Central Asia, the Middle East and India, there was the story of his rise, a story that begins not with an iron throne or golden palace, but with the dusty steps of 14th-century Transoxiana and the struggles of a minor nobleman determined to rise above obscurity. Born in 1336 in the city of Kesh, near modern-day Sharisabz in Uzbekistan, Timur belonged to the Barlas tribe, a Turco-Mongol clan that had already begun to settle and adopt some Persian and Islamic customs, blending nomadic traditions with a growing awareness of the urban centers they interacted with. The Barlas were descendants of Mongol warriors left behind in Central Asia after the campaigns of Genghis Khan, and they maintained a strong martial identity, emphasizing loyalty, courage, and battlefield prowess. Timur inherited this martial legacy, but he was not born into wealth or high political influence. His early life was marked by instability, tribal rivalries, and the constant shifting of alliances, a crucible that would forge both his cunning and ruthlessness. From a young age, Timur exhibited ambition that outstripped the expectations of his modest station. He was deeply influenced by the stories of Mongol conquest and the grandeur of Genghis Khan, who had carved an empire spanning continents. Timur, however, was keenly aware that unlike Genghis Khan, who had started from a position of tribal leadership, he lacked both the immediate authority and the wealth to command respect. This lack, paradoxically, became a driver of his relentless ambition. Historians often note that his early experiences of marginalization instilled in him both a deep desire for personal glory and a strategic mind capable of exploiting the weaknesses of others. The political environment of 14th-century Central Asia further shaped Timur's rise. The once unified Mongol Empire had fractured into various khanates, each ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan. These khanates were rife with infighting, shifting loyalties, and periodic warfare, creating a volatile landscape where power was always contested. For Timur, this fragmentation presented both a challenge and an opportunity. He could not rely on inherited legitimacy. Instead, he would need to build his reputation through military skill, shrewd alliances, and strategic marriages. Timur's initial rise was gradual but calculated. As a young man, he began consolidating support among the Barlas tribe and neighboring clans, demonstrating his leadership qualities on the battlefield. One of the earliest accounts of his prowess involves leading small-scale raids and military campaigns against rival clans, where his tactical ingenuity and willingness to take risks earned him a reputation as both formidable and fearless. Unlike other leaders who relied solely on brute force, Timur combined martial skill with careful planning, psychological manipulation, and an understanding of human ambition. He understood that loyalty could be bought, fear could be exploited, and alliances could be engineered to suit his objectives. Marriage played a significant role in Timur's ascent as well. Recognizing the importance of forging connections with powerful families, he strategically married into influential clans, thereby solidifying alliances that strengthened his political and military position. These unions were not romantic gestures. They were calculated moves in a larger game of power. Through these marriages, Timur gained access to resources, troops, and legitimacy, gradually building the foundation for the empire he envisioned. By his 20s, Timur had begun to expand his influence beyond the Barlas tribe, reaching into surrounding territories that were weakened by internal strife and the lingering effects of Mongol fragmentation. He was not merely a warlord, he was a shrewd strategist who understood the importance of timing, terrain, and psychological dominance. His campaigns often involved a blend of diplomacy and violence. He would offer terms to cities and rival leaders, promising protection or political favors, while simultaneously preparing to strike with devastating force if resistance arose. This duality, combining negotiation with overwhelming aggression would become a hallmark of his later conquests. One critical moment in Timur's rise was his ability to manipulate the legacy of Genghis Khan. While Timur himself was not a direct descendant of the great Mongol ruler, he emphasized his connection to Mongol traditions and military ideals to bolster his legitimacy. He adopted titles, symbols, and practices that evoked the Mongol past, presenting himself as a rightful heir to the conqueror's mantle. This symbolic strategy resonated with both his followers and his enemies, instilling a sense of inevitability about his ascent. To those who resisted, it also served as a warning. Timur was not merely another warlord. He was a force of history itself, claiming the mantle of destiny to justify his ambitions. By the mid-1360s, Timur had successfully unified his tribal base and extended influence over much of Transoxiana, including the key city of Samarkand, which would become the jewel of his empire. His rise was not linear or uncontested. He faced betrayal, rival claims to leadership, and constant threats from both within and outside his tribe. Yet each challenge honed his skills, reinforced his authority, and solidified his reputation as a leader who combined intelligence, ruthlessness, and unyielding ambition. Timur's story of ascent is a vivid illustration of how a man from modest beginnings could rise to shape the destiny of empires. His early life reflects the convergence of personal ambition, tribal politics, and historical circumstance. It was a world where power was fluid, survival required cunning as much as courage, and opportunity favored those willing to seize it with both hands. This crucible of instability and ambition set the stage for the later chapters of his life, chapters marked by campaigns of unparalleled destruction, the laying waste of cities, and a legacy that still evokes awe and terror. In essence, the rise of Tamerlane from a minor tribal noble to the architect of one of the largest empires of his time was a combination of personal genius, strategic marriages, military acumen, and a deep understanding of the volatile world around him. He mastered the art of leveraging both fear and loyalty, ensuring that his authority extended not just through conquest, but through psychological dominance. This foundation would prove crucial as he embarked on the campaigns that would eventually define him as one of history's most feared conquerors, a man capable of wiping entire cities off the map. Understanding Timur's rise is essential to comprehending his later brutality. His early life, marked by marginalization, competition, and political fragmentation, cultivated a mindset that saw conquest as both a means to survival and a path to immortality. It was this combination of ambition, strategy, and ruthlessness that transformed a young noble of the Barlas tribe into Tamerlane. The scourge of Central Asia and beyond. Tamerlane, or Timur, is remembered not only for the sheer scale of his conquests, but also for the precision, ruthlessness, and ingenuity with which he waged war. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Timur did not rely solely on brute force. His campaigns reflected a sophisticated understanding of military strategy, siegecraft, psychological warfare, and logistics. His ability to combine terror with tactical brilliance allowed him to subdue vast territories, defeat formidable enemies, and leave a trail of destruction that would mark him as one of history's most feared conquerors. From the very beginning of his campaigns, Timur understood that warfare was as much about planning and preparation as it was about courage and ferocity. One of his key principles was mobility. Drawing upon the nomadic traditions of the Mongols, Timur built armies that could move quickly across difficult terrain, strike unexpectedly, and retreat when necessary to avoid being bogged down by stronger defenses. This mobility gave him a decisive advantage over more static armies, allowing him to encircle, ambush, or isolate enemy forces before they could mount an effective resistance. Unlike European or Persian armies of the time, which relied heavily on fortified positions and slow-moving infantry, Timur's forces were designed for speed, flexibility, and adaptability. Central to Timur's military success was his meticulous organization of the army. He divided his forces into units based on funct. Ion, with cavalry, infantry, and specialized siege engineers operating under clear chains of command. The cavalry, particularly, was the backbone of his campaigns, composed of skilled horsemen capable of executing complex maneuvers such as feigned retreats, flanking attacks, and rapid assaults on enemy strongpoints. Timur understood the psychological effect of such tactics. Sudden attacks by swift cavalry units could demoralize defenders, causing chaos and panic even before the actual engagement began. Timur's siege tactics were equally methodical and terrifying. Cities were the linchpins of medieval power, and controlling them meant controlling resources, trade routes, and populations. Timur invested considerable time and resources in preparing for sieges, often employing a combination of deception, intimidation, and engineering. He would first gather intelligence on the city's defenses, assessing walls, gates, water supplies, and the morale of defenders. This intelligence allowed him to tailor his approach to maximize both efficiency and psychological impact. One common tactic was the use of feigned retreats or diversions to lure defenders into traps. Timur's armies would sometimes simulate withdrawal, prompting enemy forces to sally forth from the safety of their walls. Once the defenders were exposed, the retreating units would suddenly turn, surrounding and annihilating them. This blend of cunning and cruelty exemplified Timur's strategic mind. He was not content with merely breaching walls. He sought to break the will of those who resisted him. Artillery and siege engineering were also central to Timur's conquests. Although gunpowder was in its early stages, Timur utilized catapults, trebuchets, and other siege engines to batter walls and fortifications. He often had engineers construct complex siege works, including tunnels, ramps, and wooden towers to gain the upper hand. These methods allowed him to take even the most formidable cities, and when resistance persisted, he would employ terror as a weapon. Captured defenders could face mass executions, impalement, or other gruesome punishments, creating a reputation that preceded him and often caused cities to surrender without a fight. Timur's campaigns also reflected a mastery of psychological warfare. He understood that the mere threat of his army could be as powerful as the army itself. Stories of his previous atrocities, massacres, impalements, and the complete destruction of cities spread quickly across the region, serving as a form of propaganda. Leaders who heard of his approach often capitulated to avoid the fate that had befallen others. Timur leveraged fear as a strategic asset, turning it into a tool that reduced the number of battles he needed to fight and minimized the cost to his own forces. Another remarkable aspect of Timur's military strategy was his attention to logistics. Armies of the medieval period were often constrained by supply lines, which could limit the speed and range of campaigns. Timur meticulously planned the movement of troops, animals, and provisions, ensuring that his forces could sustain long marches across deserts, mountains, and steppe lands. His logistical expertise allowed him to maintain pressure on multiple fronts, striking enemies where they were weakest while keeping his forces well supplied and ready for sustained operations. Flexibility and adaptability were hallmarks of Timur's command. He did not adhere rigidly to a single strategy. Instead, he adjusted his tactics based on the terrain, the composition of enemy forces, and the psychological state of defenders. For example, in campaigns against well-fortified cities, he often combined diplomacy with siege tactics, offering terms of surrender while simultaneously preparing devastating assaults should they refuse. Against open-field opponents, he relied on the mobility and shock power of his cavalry, using complex formations and timed maneuvers to outflank and encircle enemy armies. The coordination of terror, strategy, and engineering reached its most extreme expression in Timur's treatment of conquered cities. Once a city fell, he often employed mass executions, mutilation, or deportations to ensure that the population could not rise against him again. This approach, while horrifying, served a clear military purpose. It eliminated potential threats, discouraged rebellion, and reinforced his reputation as an unstoppable force. Cities that had heard of his methods frequently surrendered without resistance, understanding that capitulation could spare lives while defiance would invite annihilation. Timur's strategies were also designed with the long-term stability of his empire in mind. He knew that a conquering army could not simply loot and leave. Infrastructure, trade routes, and administration had to be maintained. While he was ruthless in punishment, he also established garrisons, appointed governors, and secured key trade centers, ensuring that his conquests translated into lasting political control. This combination of terror and governance allowed Timur to create an empire that stretched from the Caucasus to India and from the Persian Gulf to Siberia, territories far beyond what many contemporaries could imagine. In essence, Tamerlane's military genius lay in his ability to integrate multiple elements of warfare into a cohesive and devastating strategy. He combined mobility with precision, engineering with cruelty, and logistics with psychological manipulation. His campaigns were not merely battles for territory. They were calculated operations designed to impose his will on both men and cities. While his methods were undeniably brutal, they were also highly effective, allowing him to carve an empire out of a fractured and volatile world. The legacy of Timur's military strategies and siege tactics extends far beyond the physical destruction he caused. His approach influenced later conquerors, demonstrating the power of mobility, intelligence, psychological warfare, and logistical planning in shaping the outcome of conflicts. By understanding Timur's methods, one can see how a man from the dusty steppes of Central Asia transformed himself from a regional tribal leader into the scourge of entire civilizations, leaving an indelible mark on history through strategy as much as through terror. Ultimately, Tamerlane's campaigns serve as a chilling testament to the effectiveness of military innovation when combined with unrelenting ambition and calculated brutality. His mastery of siege tactics, his use of psychological warfare, and his meticulous planning allowed him to achieve what few could: the near-total subjugation of vast regions and the creation of an empire built as much on fear as on conquest. In understanding his strategies, we also understand the terrifying efficiency of a man who saw warfare not as a series of battles, but as a science in which cities could be erased from maps and empires built on the ashes of the vanquished. To fully understand the scale of Tamerlane's conquests and the terror he unleashed, it is essential to examine the cultural and political environment of 14th-century Central Asia. This was a period defined by fragmentation, shifting allegiances, and a blend of nomadic and sedentary cultures, a volatile stage on which ambitious leaders like Timur could rise to power. The region was not a monolithic empire, but a mosaic of rival khanates, city-states, and tribal confederations, each with its own customs, military traditions, and political ambitions. This fragmented landscape provided both the opportunity and the challenge for a conqueror intent on building an empire through force and fear. The legacy of the Mongol Empire loomed large over Central Asia in the 14th century. Genghis Khan's conquests in the early 13th century had united vast territories under Mongol rule, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. However, by Timur's time, the once mighty empire had fractured into separate khanates: the Chagatai Khanate, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China, among others. These successor states were politically fragmented, often embroiled in internal conflicts over succession, territory, and control of trade routes. The Mongol legacy left the region militarized but politically unstable, creating a fertile ground for a leader with the skill and ambition to exploit weaknesses and unite or conquer the fractured lands. Central Asia was also a region of immense cultural diversity. Persian, Turkic, Mongol, and Islamic influences intermingled, creating a rich tapestry of languages, traditions, and governance systems. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Herat were not only political centers but also cultural and economic hubs, renowned for their trade, learning, and architecture. They were deeply connected to the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. Control over these cities meant access to wealth, artisans, scholars, and military recruits, making them prime targets for any ambitious conqueror. The political landscape was defined by the interplay of nomadic and sedentary power structures. Nomadic tribes, often organized into confederations, wielded military strength and mobility, while sedentary city-states controlled wealth, trade, and fortified positions. This created a dynamic tension. Nomadic warlords could steer quickly and decisively, but lacked long-term administrative structures, whereas city-states were wealthy and defensible, but often divided and vulnerable to internal strife. Timur, himself of Turco-Mongol nomadic heritage, exploited this tension masterfully. He combined the mobility, shock tactics, and discipline of nomadic armies with the strategic ambition to capture and control sedentary urban centers. The economy of 14th-century Central Asia also influenced Timur's campaigns. Trade was central to the wealth and stability of the region. Cities along the Silk Road thrived on commerce in silk, spices, precious metals, and other luxury goods. Control of these trade routes meant not only access to material wealth, but also influence over regional politics and military capacity. Timur understood that conquest was not merely about seizing land, it was about capturing the arteries of wealth and power. Cities that controlled trade became both the prize and the strategic focus of his campaigns. Religion played a significant role in shaping the cultural and political environment. Central Asia in the 14th century was predominantly Muslim, and Islamic law and governance influenced city administration, trade, and social life. Timur used religion as both a unifying and legitimizing force, presenting himself as a devout Muslim ruler who acted to protect and expand the faith. This allowed him to rally support among Islamic populations and frame his conquests as not only political but also spiritual endeavors. At the same time, religious diversity persisted, with Buddhist, Christian, and animist communities in certain regions, creating a complex social fabric that required careful manipulation and occasional brutal suppression to maintain control. Tribal dynamics further complicated the political landscape. Clans and tribes were central to identity, loyalty, and military organi. Alliances were often fluid, shifting according to immediate needs, threats, or opportunities. A successful conqueror needed not only military skill but also diplomatic acumen to manage these relationships. Timur's rise demonstrates his exceptional ability to navigate this tribal landscape. He secured alliances through marriage, promises of power, and intimidation, gradually uniting disparate groups under his authority. His understanding of tribal politics allowed him to turn potential adversaries into loyal allies or, failing that, to neutralize them with overwhelming force. The 14th century also saw technological and military innovation that shaped the nature of conflict in the region. While traditional cavalry and archery remained dominant, siegecraft and early artillery were emerging as decisive tools in warfare. Fortified cities could resist conventional assault, but Timur's campaigns demonstrated a combination of brute force and tactical ingenuity. He invested in siege technologies, employed engineers to construct war machines, and studied city defenses meticulously before launching attacks. The combination of traditional nomadic tactics with evolving siege methods gave him a strategic advantage that few contemporaries could match. The political instability of the time also meant that succession crises and internal rebellions were common. Local rulers often faced threats not only from external enemies but from family members, rival factions, and ambitious generals. Timur leveraged these instabilities to expand his influence, supporting one faction against another, using deception, and then stepping in to claim authority once the dust settled. By exploiting the fragmented political order, he was able to consolidate power more efficiently than if he had faced a united resistance. Finally, the cultural and political environment created conditions that amplified the psychological impact of Timur's campaigns. Central Asia's population had experienced cycles of conquest, rebellion, and Mongol invasions for decades, making the region both resilient and wary. Timur's reputation for cruelty, combined with the unpredictability of political alliances, made fear a crucial component of his strategy. The fragmented, competitive, and culturally rich landscape allowed him to exploit both human ambition and human terror, turning psychological warfare into a tool as powerful as his armies themselves. In conclusion, 14th century Central Asia was a land of contrasts, culturally sophisticated yet politically fragmented, economically prosperous yet vulnerable, militarily formidable yet divided. The Mongol legacy, combined with the complexities of tribal loyalties, urban wealth, trade networks, and emerging military technologies, created a stage on which a determined, ambitious, and ruthless leader could rise to extraordinary power. Timur's genius lay in his ability to read this environment, adapt his strategies, and exploit every weakness, turning a chaotic and competitive region into the foundation of a vast empire. Understanding this cultural and political landscape is essential to grasping the magnitude of Timur's later actions. His campaigns were not random acts of destruction, they were calculated responses to the opportunities and challenges presented by a fragmented and vibrant Central Asia. His mastery of this environment allowed him to not only conquer cities, but also leave an enduring mark on the region's history, culture, and collective memory. The rise of Tamerlane, therefore, cannot be separated from the complex world he inhabited, a world that both shaped him and was reshaped by his unprecedented conquests. By the time Timur, later known as Tamerlane, had consolidated his position among the Turco-Mongol tribes of Central Asia. He was ready to extend his influence beyond the steppe and into the cities that represented wealth, trade, and political power. His early campaigns, beginning in the 1360s and intensifying through the 1370s, set the pattern for his later conquests, a combination of military genius, meticulous planning, and brutal psychological warfare. The cities that fell to Timur in this period not only expanded his territorial control, but also cemented his reputation as a conqueror whose name inspired fear across the region. One of Timur's first significant targets was the city of Samarkand. Although he had connections to the region, Samarkand remained under the control of rival tribal factions. The city was not just a political center, it was also a vibrant hub of culture and trade along the Silk Road. Timur recognized that controlling Samarkand would provide a base of operations for future campaigns and a symbol of legitimacy for his emerging empire. His approach to Samarkand demonstrated the strategic mind that would characterize all his campaigns. He combined diplomacy, deception, and the threat of overwhelming force to achieve his objectives. Timur initially sought alliances with local leaders, presenting himself as a stabilizing force in a region rife with conflict. When diplomacy failed or hesitation arose, he swiftly shifted to military action. Samarkand ultimately fell after a series of calculated assaults, including the use of siege engines, feigned retreats, and coordinated cavalry attacks that disrupted the city's defenses. Once inside, Timur did not hesitate to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. Historical accounts describe mass executions of opposing leaders and public displays of punishment, sending a clear message to neighboring cities: defiance would be met with total annihilation. The capture of Samarkand marked a turning point, establishing Timur as a serious power in Central Asia. Following Samarkand Timur turned his attention to other strategic cities in Transoxiana, including Bukhara, Herat, and Balkh. Each campaign was carefully planned, often involving months of reconnaissance, supply stockpiling, and diplomatic maneuvering. Timur understood that capturing a city required more than breaching walls. It required an understanding of its political structure, economic resources, and the morale of its inhabitants. His sieges were not random acts of violence, but calculated operations designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing risk to his own forces. Bukhara, another key Silk Road city, fell after a combination of military pressure and psychological manipulation. Timur exploited internal divisions among the city's elite, supporting rival factions and turning them against one another. When the city resisted, he employed traditional siege tactics, battering the walls with catapults and trebuchets while launching coordinated cavalry assaults to cut off escape routes. The result was a city brought to its knees, with leaders executed and survivors either enslaved or deported to serve in Timur's growing empire. The fall of Bukhara reinforced Timur's reputation as a conqueror whose campaigns were marked by both strategic brilliance and uncompromising ruthlessness. In the eastern regions of Transoxiana, Timur faced additional challenges, including mountainous terrain and fortified positions that were difficult to breach. Here, he adapted his tactics, combining engineering expertise with deception. Siege towers, tunnels, and battering rams allowed his forces to overcome walls that had previously been considered impregnable. In some cases, Timur employed what could be described as early forms of psychological warfare. He would display captured leaders, execute prisoners publicly, or even spread exaggerated accounts of his cruelty to force cities to surrender without a fight. The impact was profound, as word of Timur's methods traveled faster than his army, causing cities to capitulate in advance to avoid the fate of those who resisted. Timur's campaigns were not limited to sedentary cities. He also targeted rival tribal confederations and smaller fortresses, demonstrating his ability to operate across diverse terrains and against various forms of opposition. These early campaigns served as both a proving ground for his military strategies and a means of consolidating his political power. Each city captured added not only wealth and resources, but also troops, engineers, and administrative personnel who would support further expansion. The economic impact of these early campaigns was significant. By controlling major trade hubs along the Silk Road, Timur secured access to the wealth necessary to fund his army, maintain supply lines, and commission the construction of new fortifications and cities. This economic foundation allowed him to sustain prolonged campaigns, moving his forces across hundreds of miles with well-coordinated logistics, a feat that set him apart from many contemporary rulers. One of the recurring themes in these early campaigns was Timur's use of terror as a strategic tool. The destruction of resisting cities was deliberate, calculated, and intended to create a climate of fear. Mass executions, public displays of punishment, and the razing of fortifications served as warnings to other cities. Timur understood that psychological dominance could often achieve what brute force alone could not. Cities that heard of the fate of Samarkand or Bukhara frequently surrendered without a fight, illustrating the effectiveness of fear as a weapon, in addition to traditional military might. The fall of these early cities also helped Timur establish a network of loyal admini, straitors and governors. He appointed trusted generals, family members and allies to oversee newly conquered territories, ensuring that control extended beyond mere military occupation. This administrative foresight allowed him to integrate conquered regions into a cohesive system, facilitating tax collection, law enforcement, and further military mobilization. It was a combination of conquest and governance that enabled Timur to build a foundation for his vast empire. These campaigns also had a cultural dimension. Timur often spared artisans, scholars, and craftsmen, deporting them to his capital in Samarkand to enhance the city's prestige and infrastructure. While his campaigns were marked by brutality, they also contributed to the growth of Samarkand as a center of architecture, learning, and art. The duality of destruction and construction exemplified Timur's vision. Cities could be destroyed as a warning, yet the most talented individuals could be co-opted to serve his empire, blending terror with cultural enrichment to consolidate power. In summary, Timur's early campaigns demonstrate a combination of military innovation, psychological warfare, logistical planning, and administrative foresight. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Herat, and Balkh fell not simply due to brute force, but through a careful balance of strategy, terror, and governance. These conquests provided Timur with wealth, troops, and a platform for further expansion, while simultaneously building a reputation that made his name synonymous with fear. Understanding these early campaigns is crucial to comprehending the scale and nature of Timur's later conquests. They reveal a man who was not only a brilliant strategist and military tactician, but also a master of human psychology, political manipulation, and empire building. The cities that fell to Timur in this period were the first dominoes in a chain of destruction that would extend from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf, the Caucasus, and India, illustrating the terrifying effectiveness of a conqueror who combined intellect with uncompromising ruthlessness. By the end of these early campaigns, Timur had transformed from a regional tribal leader into a formidable power whose ambitions could no longer be ignored. His successes in capturing key cities laid the groundwork for an empire built on both fear and administrative control, a pattern that would define his legacy as one of history's most feared and effective conquerors. Tamerlane, known to history as Timur, was not just a conqueror of territories but a master of psychological warfare. While his military strategies and siege tactics were undeniably brilliant, one of the most effective tools in his arsenal was fear itself. Long before his armies arrived at the gates of a city, the reputation of Timur's brutality often preceded him, compelling some rulers to surrender preemptively and forcing others into despair. His campaigns demonstrate how terror can become a weapon as decisive as swords, cavalry, or catapults, shaping not only military outcomes but also the political landscape of an entire region. Central to Timur's strategy was the careful cultivation of a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Unlike other rulers who relied solely on displays of military strength, Timur ensured that the consequences of defiance were well known. Cities that resisted him often faced annihilation, their populations massacred, leaders executed, and fortifications destroyed. These extreme acts were not merely expressions of cruelty, they were calculated measures designed to amplify his influence over both allies and adversaries. News of such devastation spread rapidly across Central Asia and beyond, carried by merchants, travelers, and fleeing refugees. The psychological impact of Timur's reputation cannot be overstated. In a world where information traveled slowly but effectively through oral networks, stories of his conquests became a powerful form of propaganda. Leaders and city officials who had previously considered resistance were often paralyzed by fear, imagining the horrors that might await them if they refused to submit. This anticipation of terror sometimes led to preemptive surrender, sparing lives but reinforcing Timur's image as an unstoppable force. In effect, fear itself became a multiplier of his military power, allowing him to achieve objectives without firing a single arrow in some cases. Timur's use of fear was closely tied to his methods of execution and public punishment. Historical accounts describe mass impalements, decapitations, and public displays of defeated leaders and soldiers. For instance, after the conquest of Isfahan, it is said that Timur ordered the construction of towers of skulls to serve as a chilling reminder of the consequences of resistance. These acts were extreme, even by medieval standards, but they were strategically calculated to create an atmosphere of dread that would ripple across regions, discouraging rebellion and facilitating subsequent conquests. The sheer scale of these punishments magnified their psychological effect, making his campaigns memorable for both their immediate violence and their enduring terror. Timur also understood the importance of symbolic terror. Cities that resisted were often destroyed in ways that sent messages to neighboring regions. The raising of walls, the execution of local leaders, and the deportation of populations served a dual purpose. They eliminated immediate threats and instilled fear in those who had yet to face him. By demonstrating that resistance had dire consequences, Timur created a reputation that operated as a form of psychological leverage, inducing the need for prolonged sieges or battles. His enemies were often fighting not just against an army, but against the very idea of Timur himself. The role of fear in Timur's conquests extended beyond cities to entire regions. Tribes, neighboring kingdoms and distant states were aware of his campaigns and the consequences of defiance. Reports of massacres and destruction traveled swiftly, influencing political decisions in areas far removed from the battlefield. In many cases, rulers opted for negotiation, tribute, or temporary alliance rather than risk the annihilation that had befallen others. Timur's reputation, therefore, functioned as an invisible yet potent weapon, shaping diplomacy, alliances, and regional power dynamics. Fear was also a tool for internal control within Timur's own empire. Conquered territories were often populated by diverse groups with differing loyalties. By employing terror strategically, Timur discouraged uprisings and reinforced obedience. Public punishments, military parades, and demonstrations of his power reminded subjects that defiance was futile. This combination of external and internal psychological dominance allowed him to govern effectively, even over vast and culturally diverse territories, without always relying on extensive garrisons or constant military intervention. Interestingly, Timur's cultivation of fear was not indiscriminate, it was highly targeted. He distinguished between those who could serve his empire and those who posed a threat. Skilled artisans, scholars, and administrators were often spared and relocated to serve his capital in Samarkand, contributing to the empire's cultural and economic development. Meanwhile, those who resisted violently or threatened his authority were dealt with harshly. This selective approach reinforced the notion that Timur was both ruthless and strategic, capable of immense cruelty but also of calculated pragmatism. The result was an empire built not only on conquest but also on the management of human behavior through fear and reward. The psychological effect of Timur's reputation was further amplified by the sheer scale of his campaigns. He did not merely conquer isolated cities, he swept across entire regions, leaving visible signs of destruction in his wake. Reports of massacres, razed fortresses, and depopulated regions created a climate in which fear was cumulative. Each new campaign added to the legend, making his name synonymous with unstoppable force. For neighboring powers, this accumulation of terror forced them to reconsider alliances, fortifications, and diplomatic strategies in ways that fundamentally shaped the geopolitics of Central Asia, the Middle East, and even parts of India. Terror also functioned as a form of psychological warfare in open battles. Timur's reputation often preceded engagements, causing enemy soldiers to hesitate, flee, or surrender before combat even began. Commanders who knew the stories of his previous campaigns sometimes lost morale before the first clash of arms. In this sense, fear became a force multiplier. It extended the reach of his army, reduced casualties among his own troops, and increased the likelihood of victory. Timur understood that. The mind could be as important a battlefield as the field itself. Finally, the long-term legacy of Timur's use of fear is evident in the way he is remembered in history. While some accounts emphasize his patronage of the arts and architecture, the enduring image is that of a conqueror whose campaigns left cities in ruins and populations devastated. His reputation for terror shaped the perception of Central Asia for generations, influencing both contemporary rivals and later historians. Fear was not merely a tactic, it was a defining feature of Timur's identity and a core element of his success. In conclusion, the reputation of terror was not an accidental byproduct of Timur's conquests. It was a deliberate and sophisticated strategy that amplified his military and political power. By cultivating fear, employing public acts of punishment, and strategically selecting when to spare or destroy, Timur created a psychological landscape in which resistance was often futile before it began. This reputation facilitated rapid conquests, stabilized his empire, and extended his influence far beyond the immediate reach of his armies. Understanding this aspect of Timur's strategy is essential to grasping the full scope of his power. He was not merely a military genius, he was a master of the human psyche, a leader who understood that terror, when wielded with precision, could be as effective as swords, siege engines, or cavalry charges. Timur's use of fear ultimately illustrates a timeless principle of conquest, that the mind can be as decisive a battlefield as the body. His campaigns stand as a chilling testament to how reputation management, and psychological dominance can shape history, leaving an enduring legacy that is remembered centuries later. In the story of Tamerlane, terror was not only a weapon, it was the foundation of an empire.